Simulacra and Simulation by Baudrillard. Read by Stеaдyy Делта. Part 7. The Strategy of the Real. The impossibility of rediscovering an absolute level of the real is of the same order as the impossibility of staging illusion. Illusion is no longer possible because the real is no longer possible. It is the whole political problem of parity, of hypersimulation or offensive simulation that is posed here. For example, it would be interesting to see whether the repressive apparatus would not react more violently to a simulated holdup than to a real holdup, because the latter does nothing but disturb the order of things, the right to property, whereas the former attacks the reality principle itself. Transgression and violence are less serious because they only contest the distribution of the real. Simulation is infinitely more dangerous because it always leaves open the supposition that, above and beyond its object, law and order themselves might be nothing but simulation. But the difficulty is proportional to the danger. How to feign a violation and put it to the test. Simulate a robbery in a large store. How to persuade security that it is a simulated robbery. There is no objective difference. The gestures, the signs are the same as for a real robbery. The signs do not lean to one side or another. To the established order, they are always the order of the real. Organize a fake holdup, verify that your weapons are harmless, and take the most trustworthy hostage so that no human life will be in danger, or one lapses into the criminal. Demand a ransom and make it so the operation creates as much commotion as possible. In short, remain close to the truth in order to test the reaction of the apparatus to a perfect simulacrum. You won't be able to do it. The network of artificial signs will become inextricably mixed up with the real elements. A policeman will really fire on sight. A client of the bank will faint and die of a heart attack. One will actually pay you the phony ransom. In short, you will immediately find yourself once again, without wishing it, in the real, one of whose functions is precisely to devour any attempt at simulation, to reduce everything to the real, that is, to the established order itself, well before institutions and justice come into play. It is necessary to see in this impossibility of isolating the process of simulation the weight of an order that cannot see and conceive of anything but the real, because it cannot function anywhere else. The simulation of an offense, if it is established as such, will either be punished less severely because it has no consequences, or punished as an offense against the judicial system, for example, if one sets in motion a police operation for nothing. But never as simulation, since it is precisely as such that no equivalence with the real is possible, and hence no repression either. The challenge of simulation is never admitted by power. How can the simulation of virtue be punished? However, as such, it is as serious as the simulation of crime. Parity renders submission and transgression equivalent, and that is the most serious crime, because it cancels out the difference upon which the law is based. The established order can do nothing against it, because the law is a simulacrum of the second order, whereas simulation is of the third order, beyond true and false, beyond equivalences, beyond rational distinctions upon which the whole of the social and power depend. Thus, lacking the real, it is there that we must aim at order. This is certainly why order always opts for the real. When in doubt, it always prefers this hypothesis, as in the army one prefers to take the simulator for a real madman. But this becomes more and more difficult, because if it is practically impossible to isolate the process of simulation through the force of inertia of the real that surrounds us, the opposite is also true, and this reversibility itself is part of the apparatus of simulation and the impotence of power. Namely, it is now impossible to isolate the process of the real or to prove the real. This is how all the holdups, airplane hijackings, etc., are now in some sense simulation holdups, in that they were already inscribed in the decoding and orchestration rituals of the media, anticipated in their presentation and their possible consequences. In short, where they function as a group of signs dedicated exclusively to their recurrence as signs, and no longer at all to their real end. But this does not make them harmless. On the contrary, it is as hyperreal events, no longer with a specific content or end, but indefinitely refracted by each other, just like so-called historical events, strikes, demonstrations, crises, etc. It is in this sense that they cannot be controlled by an order that can only exert itself on the real and the rational, on causes and ends, a referential order that can only reign over the referential, a determined power that can only reign over a determined world, but that cannot do anything against this indefinite recurrence of simulation, against this nebula whose weight no longer obeys the laws of gravitation of the real. Power itself ends by being dismantled in this space and becoming a simulation of power, disconnected from its ends and its objectives, and dedicated to the effects of power and mass simulation. The only weapon of power, its only strategy against this defection, is to re-inject the real and the referential everywhere, to persuade us of the reality of the social, of the gravity of the economy, and the finalities of production. To this end it prefers the discourse of crisis, but also, why not, that of desire. Take your desires for reality can be understood as the ultimate slogan of power, since in a non-referential world, even the confusion of the reality principle and the principle of desire is less dangerous than contagious hyperreality. One remains among principles, and among those, power is always in the right. Hyperreality and simulation are deterrents of every principle and every objective. They turn against power the deterrent that it used so well for such a long time, because in the end, throughout its history, it was capital that first fed on the destruction of every referential, of every human objective, that shattered every ideal distinction between true and false, good and evil, in order to establish a radical law of equivalence and exchange, the iron law of its power. Capital was the first to play at deterrence, abstraction, disconnection, deterritorialization, etc. And if it is the one that fostered reality, the reality principle, it was also the first to liquidate it by exterminating all use value, all real equivalence of production and wealth. In the very sense we have the unreality of the stakes and the omnipotence of manipulation. Well, today, it is this same logic that is even more set against capital. And as soon as it wishes to combat this disastrous spiral by secreting a last glimmer of reality on which to establish a last glimmer of power, it does nothing but multiply the signs and accelerate the play of simulation. As long as the historical threat came at it from the real, power played at deterrence and simulation, disintegrating all the contradictions by dint of producing equivalent signs. Today, when the danger comes at it from simulation, that of being dissolved in the play of signs, power plays at the real, plays at crisis, plays at remanufacturing artificial, social, economic, and political stakes. For power, it is a question of life and death, but it is too late. Whence the characteristic hysteria of our times, that of the production and reproduction of the real. The other production, that of values and commodities, that of the Belle Epoque of political economy, has for a long time had no specific meaning. What every society looks for in continuing to produce and to overproduce is to restore the real that escapes it. That is why today this material production is that of the hyperreal itself. It retains all the features, the whole discourse of traditional production, but it is no longer anything but its scaled-down refraction. Thus, hyperrealists fix a real from which all meaning and charm, all depth and energy of representation have vanished in a hallucinatory resemblance. Thus, everywhere the hyperrealism of simulation is translated by the hallucinatory resemblance of the real to itself. Power itself has for a long time produced nothing but the signs of its resemblance. And at the same time, another figure of power comes into play, that of a collective demand for signs of power, a holy union that is reconstructed around its disappearance. The whole world adheres to it more or less in terror of the collapse of the political. And in the end, the game of power becomes nothing but the critical obsession with power, obsession with its death, obsession with its survival, which increases as it disappears. When it has totally disappeared, we will logically be under the total hallucination of power, a haunting memory that is already in evidence everywhere, expressing at once the compulsion to get rid of it, no one wants it anymore, everyone unloads it on everyone else, and the panicked nostalgia over its loss, the melancholy of societies without power. This has already stirred up fascism, that overdose of a strong referential in a society that cannot terminate its mourning. With the extenuation of the political sphere, the president comes increasingly to resemble that puppet of power who is the head of primitive societies. Class 3. All previous presidents pay for and continue to pay for Kennedy's murder, as if in fact they were the ones who had suppressed it. Which is true phantasmatically. If not in fact, they must efface this defect and this complicity with their simulated murder, because now it can only be simulated. Presidents Johnson and Ford were both the object of failed assassination attempts, which, they were not staged, were at least perpetuated by simulation. The Kennedys died because they incarnated something, the political substance, whereas the new presidents are nothing but caricatures and fake film. Curiously, Johnson, Nixon, Ford all have this simian mug, the monkeys of power. Death is never an absolute criterion, but in this case it is significant. The era of James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, and the Kennedys, of those who really died simply because they had a mythic dimension that implies death, not for romantic reasons, but because of the fundamental principle of reversal and exchange. This era is long gone. It is now the era of murder by simulation, of the generalized aesthetic of simulation, of the murder alibi, the allegorical resurrection of death, which is only there to sanction the institution of power, without which it no longer has any substance or an autonomous reality. These staged presidential assassinations are revealing because they signal the status of all negativity in the West. Political opposition, the left, critical discourse, etc. A simulacral contrast through which power attempts to break the vicious circle of its non-existence, of its fundamental irresponsibility, of its suspension. Power floats like money, like language, like theory. Criticism and negativity alone still secrete a phantom of the reality of power. If they become weak for one reason or another, power has no other recourse but to artificially revive and hallucinate them. It is in this way that the Spanish executions still serve as a stimulant to Western liberal democracy, to a dying system of democratic values. Fresh blood. But for how much longer? The deterioration of all power is irresistibly pursued. It is not so much the revolutionary forces that accelerate this process. Often it is quite the opposite. It is the system itself that deploys against its own structures this violence that annuls all substance and all finality. One must not resist this process by trying to confront this system and destroy it, because this system that is dying from being dispossessed of its death expects nothing but that from us, that we give the system back its death, that we revive it through the negative. End of revolutionary praxis, end of the dialectic. Curiously, Nixon, who was not even found worthy of dying at the hands of the most insignificant, chance, unbalanced person, and though it is perhaps true that presidents are assassinated by unbalanced types, this changes nothing. The leftist penchant for detecting a rightist conspiracy beneath this brings out a false problem. The function of bringing death to, or the prophecy, etc., against power has always been fulfilled, from primitive societies to the present, by demented people, crazy people, or neurotics, who nonetheless carry out a social function as fundamental as that of presidents, was nevertheless ritually put to death by Watergate. Watergate is still a mechanism for the ritual murder of power. The American institution of the presidency is much more thrilling in this regard than the European. It surrounds itself with all the violence and vicissitudes of primitive powers, of savage rituals, but already impeachment is no longer assassination. It happens via the Constitution. Nixon has, nevertheless, arrived at the goal of which all power dreams, to be taken seriously enough to constitute a mortal enough danger to the group, to be one day relieved of his duties, denounced, and liquidated. Ford doesn't even have this opportunity anymore. A simulacrum of an already dead power, he can only accumulate against himself the signs of reversion through murder. In fact, he is immunized by his impotence, which infuriates him. In contrast to the primitive right, which foresees the official and sacrificial death of the king or the chief is nothing without the promise of his sacrifice, the modern political imaginary goes increasingly in the direction of delaying, of concealing for as long as possible the death of the head of state. This obsession has accumulated since the era of revolutions and of charismatic leaders. Hitler, Franco, Mao, having no legitimate heirs, no filiation of power, see themselves forced to perpetuate themselves indefinitely. Popular myth never wishes to believe them dead. The pharaohs already did this. It was always one and the same person who incarnated the successive pharaohs. Everything happens as if Mao or Franco had already died several times and had been replaced by his double. From a political point of view, that a head of state remains the same or is someone else doesn't strictly change anything, so long as they resemble each other. For a long time now, a head of state, no matter which one, is nothing but the simulacrum of himself, and only that gives him the power and the quality to govern. No one would grant the least consent, the least devotion to a real person. It is to his double, he being always already dead, to which allegiance is given. This myth does nothing but translate the persistence, and at the same time the deception of the necessity of the king's sacrificial death. We are still in the same boat. No society knows how to mourn the real power, the social itself, which is implicated in the same loss. And it is through an artificial revitalization of all this that we try to escape this fact. This situation will no doubt end up giving rise to socialism, through an unforeseen turn of events and via an irony that is no longer that of history. It is from the death of the social that socialism will emerge, as it is from the death of God that religions emerge, a twisted advent, a perverse event, an unintelligible reversion to the logic of reason, as is the fact that power is in essence no longer present except to conceal that there is no more power, a simulation that can last indefinitely because as distinct from true power, which is or was a structure, a strategy, a relation of force, a stake, it is nothing but the object of a social demand. And thus, as the object of the law of supply and demand, it is no longer subject to violence and death. Completely purged of a political dimension, it, like any other commodity, is dependent on mass production and consumption. Its spark has disappeared. Only the fiction of a political universe remains. The same holds true for work. The spark of production, the violence of its stakes, no longer exist. The whole world still produces, and increasingly but subtly, work has become something else, a need as Marx ideally envisioned it, but not in the same sense. The object of a social demand, like leisure, to which it's equivalent in the course of everyday life. A demand exactly proportional to the loss of a stake in the work process. Same change in fortune as for power. The scenario of work is there to conceal that the real of work, the real of production, has disappeared, and the real of the strike as well, which is no longer a work stoppage, but its alternate pole in the ritual scansion of the social calendar. Everything occurs as if each person had, after declaring a strike, occupied his place and workstation and recommended production, as is the norm in a self-managed occupation. Exactly in the same terms as before, all while declaring himself and in virtually being permanently on strike. This is not a dream out of science fiction. Everywhere it is a question of doubling the process of work, and of a doubling of the process of going on strike. Striking incorporated, just as obsolescence is in objects, just as crisis is in production. So there is no longer striking nor work, but both simultaneously. That is to say something else, a magic of work, so as not to say a melodrama of production, a collective dramaturgy on the empty stage of the social. It is no longer a question of the ideology of work, the traditional ethic that would obscure the real process of work and the objective process of exploitation, but of the scenario of work. In the same way, it is no longer a question of the ideology of power, but of the scenario of power. Ideology only corresponds to a corruption of reality through signs. Simulation corresponds to a short circuit of reality and to its duplication through signs. It is always the goal of the ideological analysis to restore the objective process. It is always a false problem to wish to restore the truth beneath the simulacrum. That is why, in the end, power is so much in tune with ideological discourses and discourses on ideology. That is, they are discourses of truth, always good for countering the mortal blows of simulation, even and especially if they are revolutionary.